It is still dark. A woman is walking alone toward a tomb cut into solid rock, and she has not slept. Not really, since Friday. Her name is Mary Magdalene. 3 days ago, she watched a man die who had once cast 7 tormenting spirits out of her body and given her back her own mind. You don't walk away easily from someone who did that for you. Now, she is walking back to the only place that still has anything left of him. She expects a sealed stone and a guarded grave. She gets neither. This is not a story about an empty tomb. This is not a story about a stone rolled away. This is not a story about angels dressed in white, though all 3 of those things happened that morning. This is a story about who got there first and what that detail says about everything that came after. Because somewhere on this list of witnesses, near the very end, is a man who walked beside Jesus for 3 years, ate with him, watched him heal lepers and silence storms. And when his own closest friends told him Jesus was alive, this man, out of everyone, said no, not until he saw it with his own eyes. You will meet him before this is over, but not yet. Right now, there is only a woman in the dark, grief still wet on her face, walking toward a tomb she expects to find sealed. Picture standing exactly where she is standing, sure of nothing except your own grief. That's where this story starts. She has no idea what she is about to become. The stone is not where it should be. You can imagine the first feeling that hits her. Not relief, not yet. Confusion, then panic. Someone has taken the body. Mary turns and runs, sandals slapping against the path, back toward the house where the disciples are hiding, and she tells Peter and another disciple what she found. They run too. They look inside, see folded linen where a corpse should be, and leave, still not understanding, still not believing, just confused men walking back into the city. Mary doesn't leave. She stays at the tomb alone, and she weeps. You know this kind of weeping, the kind that doesn't ask permission, the kind that comes from someplace lower than thought. She bends down and looks inside the tomb one more time, and this time there are 2 figures in white asking her why she's crying. She barely registers them. She turns around, and a man is standing behind her, and she assumes, reasonably in a graveyard before sunrise, that he's the gardener. "Woman, why are you weeping?" he asks her. "Who are you looking for?" She still doesn't see it. Grief has a way of making the obvious invisible. You've probably had a moment like that yourself, staring straight at the answer and still not seeing it because your eyes were too full to focus. Then he says one word, her name, Mary, and something in her, recognition older than thought, deeper than eyesight, answers before her mind catches up. She says it back to him in her own language, the word her people used for a teacher you didn't just respect but belong to, Rabboni. Not simply teacher, closer to my teacher, the one who's mine. The first words spoken to anyone after the resurrection were a name. The first words spoken back were a relationship. Here's what most people miss about what happens next. Mary doesn't get to stay. Jesus tells her to go and tell the others, and she does. A woman who, 3 days earlier, had been one of the only people willing to stand near a crucifixion, is now the first person in human history sent to deliver the news that changes everything. She is not alone in this. Other women, Joanna among them, a woman with connections inside Herod's own household, not exactly someone easily dismissed, had been at the tomb too, and on their way back, they meet Jesus on the road. They fall at his feet. They worship him before a single apostle has seen him risen. Then they go and tell the men, and the men do not believe them. Luke records it plainly. The apostles heard the women's report and treated it as nonsense, idle talk, the kind of thing you nod along to and quietly dismiss. You have to sit with how strange that is. In that world, a woman's testimony in a courtroom counted for little, sometimes nothing at all. So if you were inventing a resurrection story in the 1st century, hoping anyone would believe it, The last thing you would do is build your whole case on the word of women first. You'd put a man's name at the top of the list, a respected one, maybe a Roman centurion, maybe a priest. Instead, the record says a woman first, women second, and the men, the ones who should have known better, calling it nonsense before they'd even checked. That detail wasn't helpful for convincing skeptics back then, which is exactly why it's hard to explain away now. So pause for a second and count what you've just heard. The first person to see Jesus alive was a woman the early church could have quietly left out of the story and made things easier on themselves. They didn't. The second and third witnesses were women too. And the men who should have been the heroes of this story, the apostles, are the ones who got it wrong first, calling the whole thing nonsense. Stay with me. It gets stranger from here because the next man on this list is about to run toward the same tomb and still walk away more confused than convinced. If you're new here, this channel exists for exactly this, pulling apart the details of scripture most people read past. Hit subscribe before we keep going, because the next two witnesses are where this story stops being simple. Peter doesn't walk, he runs. After hearing Mary's story, something in him won't sit still. You know that feeling. When news lands and your body moves before your mind has decided anything. He gets to the tomb first this time, outrunning the other disciple beside him, and bends down to look inside. He sees the linen wrappings lying flat, undisturbed, the kind of detail you only notice if you were trained your whole life to notice grave robbery. Grave robbers don't fold the cloth. They don't leave it behind at all. Peter looks, and then he leaves, confused. Luke says he went away wondering, not believing yet, just carrying a question he doesn't know what to do with. 3 days earlier, this same man had denied even knowing Jesus 3 times before a rooster finished crowing. Now he's the first individual male witness to the empty tomb, and he still walks away without an answer. Belief, it turns out, doesn't arrive all at once. Sometimes it has to catch up with the evidence. You may know exactly what that feels like. Believing something is true long before you can say why. That same afternoon, 2 more disciples are walking the 7 miles from Jerusalem to a village called Emmaus. One of them is named Cleopas. They're talking through everything that happened: the trial, the cross, the strange report from the women, when a stranger falls into step beside them and asks what they're discussing. It's Jesus. They don't recognize him. For 7 miles, they walk next to the risen Christ, explaining the crucifixion to him like he wasn't there. And something, grief maybe, or simple human blindness, keeps them from seeing what's right beside them. You've walked beside something true before and missed it too, simply because grief had narrowed your eyes. He opens the scriptures to them as they walk, showing them why the Messiah had to suffer before he could reign. Still nothing. It isn't until they sit down to eat, until he takes bread in his hands and breaks it the way he always did, that something clicks open in them. Their eyes are open, and the moment they recognize him, he's gone. Pay attention to this part, because it matters. Recognition didn't come from new information. They'd had the scriptures explained to them the whole walk. It came from something familiar: bread, broken the way it always was, in the hands that always did it that way. That same evening, 10 of the apostles are gathered behind locked doors, terrified, when Jesus simply appears in the room with them. Not knocking, not waiting, just there. He shows them his hands, his side, eats in front of them to prove he isn't a ghost. And for the first time, the men believe, 10 of them, because one is missing. His name is Thomas, called Didymus, the twin, and he isn't in that room. Maybe he had somewhere else to be. Maybe grief kept him away. Whatever the reason, by the time he comes back, his 10 closest friends are telling him the exact same thing the women told all of them that morning. He's alive. We saw him. And Thomas says no. The Greek word used for what Thomas becomes in that moment is apistos. Not simple doubt, but something more stubborn. A settled refusal to trust someone else's word. 10 witnesses. 10 friends he trusts with his life. and it still isn't enough for him. He's the man from the opening, the one who walked with Jesus for 3 years and still wouldn't believe. 8 days pass. 8 days of Thomas sitting in the same room as 10 men he trusts with his life, hearing the same story over and over and still not believing it. Not because he's stupid, not because he's faithless in some easy, lazy way people like to imagine. He loved Jesus enough to once say he'd die with him in Jerusalem. This isn't a man who doesn't care. You may have spent your own 8 days like that, wanting badly to believe something and refusing to fake it until you actually did. Then Jesus is there again. Same locked room, same sudden appearing. And this time, he goes straight to Thomas. Put your finger here, he says. Look at my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe. He doesn't rebuke him from a distance. He walks toward the one man who said no and holds out the wounds as the answer. And Thomas, the twin, the skeptic, the one who needed more than anyone else's word, says 4 words that go further than anything Peter or Mary or the women said at the tomb. My Lord and my God. Stop and notice what just happened. The most stubborn skeptic in the entire group ends up with the highest declaration in the entire gospel. Not you're alive, not I was wrong. My Lord and my God. Words you say to no one else in that world but the God of Israel himself. This is not a story about a man who happened to doubt. This is not a story about a weak faith getting rescued. This is not a story about an exception to the rule. This is a story about how God meets the hardest skeptic in the room and doesn't ask him to apologize first, just to look. Here's where it gets stranger still. Almost 200 years later, a pagan critic named Celsus wrote an entire attack on Christianity, and one of his sharpest objections was this: the resurrection rests on the word of a hysterical woman. He meant it as a knockout punch. The church father Origen had to answer it directly in writing because the objection had teeth. Think about why that objection even existed. In that world, a woman's word carried little legal weight. So if the resurrection accounts were invented, built to convince a skeptical Roman world, nobody would have started the list with Mary Magdalene and ended it with a man who needed to put his own hand in the wound before he'd say a word. You don't build a convincing lie on your weakest witnesses. You build it on your strongest ones. The fact that the story doesn't do that is exactly why it's still standing 2,000 years later. Mary first, the women second, the apostles slow, Thomas last and loudest. That's not the order you choose if you were making it up. That's the order you get when you're simply reporting what happened. So here's what actually happened in order. Mary Magdalene first, alone, grieving, the least credible witness by the standards of her own world. The other women second, falling at his feet before a single apostle saw anything. Peter third, running to an empty tomb and walking away with more questions than answers. 2 disciples on a dusty road to Emmaus, recognizing him only in the breaking of bread. 10 frightened men behind a locked door. And last, loudest, Thomas, who needed to touch the wound before he'd say the words that outran everyone else's. 3 takeaways before you go. First, the order of these witnesses wasn't random, and nobody fabricating a story for first century credibility would have chosen it. The least believable witness goes first. The most stubborn skeptic gets the strongest confession. That's not how you build a convincing lie. Second, not one person on this list believed easily. Not the woman who loved him most. Not the disciple who walked beside him for years. Not even the men who watched him raise the dead with their own eyes. If belief didn't come easy for them, standing in the same room as the risen Christ, it was never going to come easy for you either. And that's not a failure. That's just what it costs to believe something this big. Third, and this is the one that matters most, Thomas is still in the room. He's the one who said no, the one who needed proof instead of someone else's word. And Jesus didn't walk away from him. He walked toward him, held out his own wounds, and let Thomas touch the one thing that would settle it. If that's you right now, if you're the one still saying you need more before you'll believe it, You're not standing outside this story. You're standing exactly where Thomas stood, and he still got an answer. Which witness in this list do you relate to the most? Tell me below.